Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Glad you're all here. I see faint signals from Vega. Welcome, welcome. Glad you're here joining us. Who else is here today? We've got so much to discuss, so much to talk about. It's going to be a fun Christopher. What else is new? Who's with us today? Now is the time, if you haven't already done it, to tweet this out. I see Lisa Hauserman. Welcome, Lisa. I see Tim. Hey, Caleb, says Tim. Well, hey to you as well. I see Alfred Kaholic. You look exhausted. I'm not exhausted. I'm having a great day, but I'm not in my usual location. As you will notice, Joe Howard, Filthy Commie, Herb Bryant, JT24, Lincolnite Yankee. As you all will notice, I am in a different part of my lovely Brooklyn apartment, but I'm here. Lucas Marshall, Descartes' Soul. Hello, Caleb. A hello back to you. Levon. Marva, Alex Giovanni, Stanley Stan, Nathaniel, Proletarian Center, Heidi Edelweiss, faint signals from Vega, Logan Hodge. Glad you all are here. What a day it is. Shout out to Eve in Colorado. What a day it is. I want to dedicate... Shout out to LK. Shout out to Joe Howard. Folks, now is the time, if you haven't already subscribed, to hit the subscribe button. If you have subscribed, click the bell. Click the bell to make sure you get notifications. And make sure that you're still subscribed, because a friend of mine who subscribed and hit the notifications for some reason didn't get notifications. I notice other people have told me they were subscribed and then somehow they were not subscribed. So make sure that you're still subscribed, right? And if you are not getting notifications, make sure that you are hitting that bell so you get notifications. We want this to be as big of a conversation as possible. We're all friends here. We're a special little community here. It's a lovely time. I see folks joining us from Belgium. I see folks joining us from the UK. We see Adam from Germany who's joining us. So many people joining us. I'm in my Brooklyn apartment, just a different part of it today. I'm doing this not in front of my bookshelf, but from the bedroom. That's where I'm doing this. So glad you're joining us. Glad you're with us. So much that we can discuss. I actually want to dedicate today's live to a group of people who I'm sure are in a world of hurt right now. They are suffering. They're not in a good place. I'm not encouraging their behavior. I'm not condoning necessarily what their particular habit is. But I want to give them a shout out because I know they're suffering. You'll see that headline on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Deaths promote alert about vaping risks. If you are one of the people who vapes, I'm not encouraging you to vape. In fact, you probably really shouldn't be vaping, as we're hearing from the Food and Drug Administration. But I know you're in a world of hurt right now. Health authorities are urging people to stop using electronic cigarettes and other vaping products while they investigate 3 more deaths from a mysterious illness that federal officials say may have affected more than 450 users of the device around the U.S. Folks, vaping is a vice. It's like smoking cigarettes. It's like eating unhealthy food. It's like, dare I say, drinking a certain unnamed diet beverage that I try not to ever mention by name because I don't want to give product placement advertising to. It's something I have a feeling that people who vape probably know they shouldn't be vaping, right? People who smoke cigarettes know they shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. People who vape know they shouldn't vape. People who overindulge in the sweet stuff, the donuts and the cupcakes, it's a vice. And your vice is not good for you, but it's something that you figured out to do in order to get through the world. And I can tell you, as somebody who is totally addicted to that diet soda that will not be named, who needs that caffeine rush, I'll tell you, if it was in the news that people were dying and getting a mysterious disease as a result of my favorite diet soda, I would be very miserable because I would have to stop drinking it very suddenly because I wouldn't want to die, but it would ruin my daily routine and it would throw me off. So if you are a vapor, if you are someone who vapes, I urge you to do the right thing for your body. Due to this new announcement, stop vaping, but you have my sympathy because vaping's part of your routine. It's something that keeps you going, and you're all of a sudden not doing it in order to get by. And I deeply sympathize with you, and I'm sorry this has happened to you. Even though, in a way, it might be good for you in the long term. If you can give up that vaping vice, it's probably better for your health. But you're probably in a world of addicted hurt right now, going, oh my goodness, my daily routine is shot. I can't vape. It's going to kill me. People are dying from this mysterious lung disease. Oh my God. So I sympathize with those who vape. Shout out to Ramiro. Shout out to Julian Drews. Shout out to all of you who are with us. I saw there was somebody from Serbia. We're all a community here. We're having a great time. Ramiro says, Kim Il-sung had great writings about self-discipline and getting over drugs and alcohol. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to get into a little more self-care, self-helpy kind of stuff today. I'm going to talk about the news, of course. I'm going to talk about world events and ideology, but because you all are so important to me, right? Because I see each of you as a glimmer of hope, a little star in a dark sky for the future, I'm going to give you some insights. Thank you, Lawrence Chu, for that super chat. I'm going to give you some insights, just a few insights into making yourself as happy as you possibly can be, because the more happy you are, the more effective you will be in spreading the world truth in the world of darkness. Now, Faint Signals from Vega says she used to be a diet beverage consumer and she kicked the habit. So perhaps there is hope for me yet. But yes, I do sympathize with those who vape. But I want to tell you all about where I was for the last 2 days. I was in Providence, Rhode Island. And that was a very, very interesting trip. I had never been to Providence, Rhode Island before. Rhode Island was on the map at school. It was the smallest U.S. state. It was the smallest U.S. state. It was on the map, and, that's what I knew about it. I had seen the show Family Guy, but Family Guy is a cartoon, so I really didn't think that, that was reality, and of course it isn't. So I really knew nothing about Rhode Island. Nothing about it. So I went out to Rhode Island. I knew that Brown University was in Providence, Rhode Island. And I went out to Rhode Island because a guy named Joel, who I hope is watching right now, great fellow named Joel, really a dedicated guy. Joel is building this place called Community Cafe. And it's a place that's going to involve people doing, volunteer work. There's going to be a food bank run out of there. There's going to be, presentations about politics and political education. It's a great place. He's got a picture of Malcolm X there. He's trying to arrange for different progressive voices to come and give presentations. So it was great to go out and give a presentation at Community Cafe. And Joel has really put his heart and soul into building Community Cafe. And that is really, really great. Joel is a guy who's really, really dedicated to building it. And I got to meet Joel. I got to meet Joel's son. I got to meet some of Joel's relatives. I also got to meet an interesting person, a woman who is herself a former nun and a peace activist who has run for Congress in Rhode Island. Very interesting woman. A lot of insights came up during the discussion. I got to meet a guy, a longtime anti-war peace activist guy named Dave. He from Boston, great guy. He told me about his days protesting Richard Nixon back in the day. Very interesting conversation I had. Got to meet a younger guy named Ben. Shout out to Ben. Wow, great. Great guy. Follows China very closely. Had a lot of interesting insights. I think he's a student organizer and activist out there in Rhode Island. Great guy. Glad I got to meet Ben. Who else did I meet? Well, I also got to meet the folks who are deeply involved with the George Wiley Center, which is a group that fights on behalf of, it's a building. It's a center that fights on behalf of low-income and working people in Providence, Rhode Island. And I actually got to go visit the day after I gave my presentation. I got to go stop by this George Wiley Center, and it was a beautiful place. It was an office dedicated to fighting for working families in Providence. Beautiful. Wow, I went there. They are dealing with electricity and utility shutoffs, right? Fighting against that. They're connected. I believe they work with the Poor People's Campaign, which which is a great group, a lot of Christian ministers that are opposed to the crimes of capitalism and want to promote peace and democracy and equality. Great stuff, great stuff. So I'm glad I got to go to Providence, Rhode Island. It was great, and I gave a presentation to a good gathering. We talked about my new book, answered people's questions. I will say, I thought it was interesting because the crowd that came out to see me speak at Community Cafe and listen to my presentation, they were there to hear about the new book, right? The new book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. They were there to hear about that book. But I noticed there were more questions at the event about my previous book, Getting Rich Without Capitalism. I thought that was amusing. Very, very interesting. People had questions about that book. So I think that's really, really cool. Hey, maybe we ought to revisit that book. Maybe I ought to do some readings from Getting Rich Without Capitalism. It continues to sell. I'll get on there and I'll check, and people continue ordering that book. It struck a chord, that book. I've got the fastest train in the world on the cover. I talk about China. I talk about Huey Long and every man a king, but none shall wear a crown. And I noticed that a lot of the Q&A, even though I'd read from City Builders and Vandals, a lot of the Q&A people wanted to talk about getting rich without capitalism. So, hey, maybe we should continue to revisit that in some of our live chats and discussions. But it was great to go out to Providence. It was beautiful. I'm glad I did it. Great folks out there fighting the good fight. Shout out to Joel, very dedicated fellow. Shout out to the folks at the George Wiley Center. Wow, I'm glad I went out there, and it's just like so many other cities in the United States, right? So many other cities. Beautiful downtown with expensive hotels and restaurants. That's a few blocks. But you get a little further out, it's working people that are struggling. Working people that are suffering. It's boarded up stores. It's a lot of people who've been really screwed by this system where the rich rule and the people are left behind. So shout out to everyone who's joining us. MMRED is with us. Kevin Calber-Matten is with us. Nathaniel Adams is with us. Shout out to all of you. Wow. Shout out to Owen. Shout out to someone who calls himself Otto. Glad you're all here. I see a lot of questions, and I want to get to whatever is on your minds, folks. Plenty to talk about. Prol Center is with us. So much that we can talk about today. But because I value each and every one of you, and because I see you all as very, very important, I want to touch on a few things. I want to touch on a few points. Because I want you all to be happy. Because when you are happy, you are more effective. And if you're more effective, the hope for us getting towards socialism, getting toward a society where the major centers of economic power are controlled by the people and not operated for the irrationality of profits, that's much closer. The happier you are, the more effective you are. The more effective you are, the closer we get to socialism. And you're my family here. You are my little live community. I love each and every one of you. We are a community here. We're tight-knit, and I care about you all. So on that note, I am going to give you some pointers. Caleb Maupin's life advice number 1. Consume music carefully. Consume music carefully. Now, it sounds kind of stupid. You're like, what's he getting at here? Okay, folks, people think a lot about their diet. All right, they think, hey, I want to eat healthy. Is this food good for me? Is this food not good for me? People think a lot about their diet. But if you're worried about keeping yourself happy and keeping yourself optimistic, keeping yourself full of energy to keep going, what music you listen to is very, very important. It's very, very important. Music is full of emotion. It's full of emotion. And I will tell you, my ability to be optimistic and to be happy vastly improved when I started to put classical music into my life. When I made the conscious choice to listen to classical music every night before I went to bed and every morning when I wake up. And there's a reason for that. It's because music nowadays, a lot of music is highly emotional, and doesn't really stimulate the intellectual side of your mind. right? It doesn't really intellectually stimulate you. It stimulates your emotions, right? You get pumped up, you want to go, ah, you're really angry, you're really sad, you're really happy, but it's not teaching you to do what the rational part of your mind does, which is notice patterns. Like classical music, you listen to Bach, you listen to Beethoven, you listen to Mozart. It's all patterns. And classical music enhances your ability to think rationally and think about patterns. And I have noticed a huge improvement in my ability to be optimistic by listening to classical music. Now, I'm not opposed, and I will say this, right? Just like people that eat healthy occasionally have, a hot dog or a donut, right? Getting through the day, I'll put on some rock music, I'll put on, some more modern music. But having that foundation of classical music and making it a conscious choice not only to listen to classical music, but to understand classical music, but to making it a choice to learn to appreciate classical music has done a world of good for me in terms of improving my mood. And I think one great exercise, one beautiful exercise, take a piece of classical music that you really like and figure out why you like it. Maybe you could do this with some rock music that you like, or some jazz music that you like, or some other music that you like. But pick the piece that you most enjoy listening to, and go over it with a telescope. Go over it with a go over it with a fine-toothed comb. Figure out why you like it. Listen to it carefully. Think about, okay, at this part, it's affecting me this way. At this part, it's affecting me this way. Try to figure out why you find that piece to be good and stimulating. Right? Go over that piece of music that you really enjoy carefully. Go over it carefully and figure out why it is that you like it that way. Do it. And as you do it, you'll be figuring out what it is about the piece that makes it effective, and you'll also be figuring out how your own mind works. It's a great, great exercise. So that's Caleb Maupin's advice for feeling good, number 1. Be sure to consume your music carefully. Make room for classical music. That's advice number 1. Advice number 2. And this one may make me sound like a little bit of a hypocrite, because I'm here on YouTube, on social media, telling you this. I'm telling you to control your social media use. Make social media serve you. Do not live your life to serve social media. For me, right, I'm on it all, right? Well, I'm not on it all. I'm not on Instagram, but I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm here on YouTube. But I'm urging you, turn off the notifications for your Facebook. Turn off the notifications for your Twitter. Get on Facebook when you want to get on Facebook. Get on Twitter when you want to get on Twitter. Right? Make social media serve you. Don't serve social media. I know so many people, and I've been there before, who are almost a slave to social media. Almost a slave to it. Right? Oh, got another notification. Better pull my phone out. What? Who's liking me now? Someone's retweeting me. Oh, who's following me now? Don't do it. Don't fall into that trap. Make social media serve you. Right? When you feel like getting on Twitter, get on Twitter. When you feel like getting on Facebook, get on Facebook. But make social media serve you. Right? Now, that doesn't apply to messenger apps, right? I use Facebook Messenger. I use, texting. And obviously, you need to know if someone's messaging you. But if somebody really needs to reach you, if you really need to know something really important's happening, you'll get a text about it. You'll get a message about it. You'll get a WhatsApp about it, right? Messenger apps are different. But when it comes to social media apps, general social media apps, they exist for your own pleasure. You do not exist to jump whenever they call. They have no right to run your life. Right? Pearl Center is saying Twitter is addictive. Totally. Right? And so is Instagram, which I've never used. So is Facebook. They're all addictive. But all of them also, you know, especially when people get into, I don't know what it is, Facebook arguments are toxic. I have never seen a Facebook argument lead anywhere good. Especially. But, you know, I mean, Twitter, all of them kind of pull negativity out of you. I'll be honest. They pull a kind of negative, combative, angry feeling out of you. And so if you want to be the master of your own universe, you control social media, and you don't let social media control you, right? Turn off the notifications on your Facebook, on your Twitter, right? Go on Facebook when you feel like going on Facebook. Go on Twitter when you feel like going on Twitter. Don't let those notifications pile up and tell you when to get on social media. That's Caleb Maupin's advice number 2. Caleb Maupin's advice for feeling good number 2. And Caleb Maupin's advice number 3. And this one's a little more abstract. It's not specific. Learn to think long term. And it's hard. And I'm not telling you to space out. I'm not telling you to be distant. I'm not telling you not to be in the moment. But I'm telling you to constantly put every event in your life, put the present moment that you're in a bigger context. When you're talking to somebody, fit that conversation into your understanding of your entire life, of the next year, of the next week. Be able to give everything a context. Right? Think long term. Think about the past, think about the present, and think about the future simultaneously. Have what they call an observer. A psychological view that isn't stuck in the present, that takes into context the past and the future and the present at the same time. Learn to be in the moment. Don't dissociate. Don't be in your own head, not in touch with reality. But learn to put the future and the past in the same context. You do that, and you'll be much happier. Do those 3 things. Those are 3 points of advice from Caleb. Point number 1, fit classical music into your life. Consume music carefully. Not based on just what feels good in the moment, but how you want to feel. Point number 2 is let social media serve you. Don't serve social media. Control social media. Get on social media because you want to control it. And point number 3 is learn to have an observer and think long term. Put events in your life, put the present moment that you're in into a long context. Be able to think about the present, the past, and the future in the same moment. And if you can do those things, you will be much happier. At least that's my experience. Oh boy. Now I see people want to ask me about Sam Marcy, the founder of the Workers' World Party. I see that people want to ask me about Robert Mugabe, the leader of Zimbabwe. I see that people want to talk about all kinds of things. Well, I see people continue to talk about destiny. I almost want to be like, who? Destiny? Who's that? What? Who? What? You know, I mean, that guy is still talking about it. I mean, I got on there on Twitter today, and he's still like, you know, he cannot deal with what happened in that debate. So, whatever. I debated him. You can watch it on my channel. 7,000 people have already watched it here. 56,000 people have watched that debate on his channel so far. Another 12,000 watched it on this other channel. Yeah, I mean, I'm finished with destiny. I gave him 2.5 hours of my life, and he is still reeling from it. You know, well, that's his problem now. That's his problem. You can watch it. I've even highlighted some selections from that conversation. You can watch it. But there you go. It happened. Life goes on. I think it was a success. It was a big win for our community. I feel very, very good coming out of that debate. Ramiro Funes says Destiny got mopped. And there are many comments to that effect from people I have never met, people I've never seen before, people I don't know, seem to agree that there you go. Michael Moran seems to agree. Peter Knopfler says, why watch it? Well, good question. I thought it went very well. But yes, I know there's a lot of you here. We're a great community. I know, however, that some of you haven't subscribed, so be sure to subscribe. Yeah, I think it went well. I think it was a win for our community, and that's all I can say. You know, but there you go. I will say, as much as Destiny can be a little obnoxious, and I'd never heard of him until people wanted me to debate him. I'd never heard of this guy, right? It's weird, you know. I mean, it's like when people said Destiny, they're like, yes, everyone knew who he was. I'd never heard of this fella. I looked him up and I was listening to his debates with people, and I just found him to be very, very obnoxious. But I saw his following, I saw his popularity. I thought, okay, if he wants me to come on there and defend socialism, I must and will do it. And so I did it, you know, and I must say, I think he sincerely believes that central planning, socialism, has never been successful. And I think a lot of people sincerely believe that, because that's what you're told in U.S. society all the time. You're told that. I think he sincerely believes that. It's just that's not true. And in the debate, he really tried hard to hold on to his belief. And at certain points, you can watch him get uncomfortable because he realizes that what I'm saying is true. And it's like a hard pill for him to swallow. But China, the Soviet Union, had huge, tremendous economic successes, and central planning does work. And he tries his hardest not only to argue that it's not real, but he tries to hold on to his belief that that's not the case. That socialism in China, that socialism in the Soviet Union, socialism in Cuba has utterly failed everywhere it's ever been tried. He tries to hold on to that belief. He really, really, really wants to keep believing that. But that's just not factual. So you can do every debating technique in the world. You can say, oh, that's not a real statistic, or that statistic doesn't count. That's just one statistic. You can do that. You can do every ninth grade trophy winning debating technique, and it doesn't change the reality. Doesn't change the reality. So there you go. That's all I got to say about that. Don't want to dwell on it too much longer. But he's dwelling on it. My goodness, how long has it been and he's still tweeting at me about it? Goodness gracious. I appreciate it, but, I gave him 2.5 hours, There was some talk about having a debate about Venezuela with him. Maybe if that presents itself, I would revisit that. But I kind of don't want to. I kind of feel like, I got what I needed. I don't really see a need for a rematch. So there you go. Yeah, I wanted to mention a couple things that came to mind before we get to the questions people had. But we'll get to that. People want to know about Sam Marcy. I'll talk a little bit about Sam Marcy. People want to know about Robert Mugabe. I'll talk a little bit about Robert Mugabe. But I wanted to mention a couple other things that are on my mind. First of all, can't resist. 5G, fifth generation wireless. China is winning in the race to 5G. And if you read this article from the Wall Street Journal about China's efforts to get into 5G, it is so apparent that China's victories in terms of 5G are very, very linked to their socialism. I'm going to read you a couple highlights that just kind of illustrate that. Right? China is speeding ahead just like they are with artificial intelligence, just like they are with high-speed railway, just like they are with so many fields: supercomputers, telecommunications, the biggest cell phone telecommunications manufacturer in the world. I mean, so this is not me. This is the Wall Street Journal. As it did in constructing its high-speed rail network and the Olympic Games infrastructure, the Chinese government has flexed its authoritarian top-down power to clear red tape for a 5G project that it deems to be a national priority. It has directed regulators, provincial and local governments, and its 3 major state-owned wireless carriers to work together. Right? In the U.S., where residents are prone to complain loudly about new cell phone towers going up next door, Washington's strategy is far from unified. Right? There are 3 major wireless companies in China, but the state is forcing them and the government to team up to bring China into the lead as they race ahead on 5G, right? The state is controlling the means of production, the means of communication in this case, and forcing them to work together, and so the public can get the best result. A government of action. Imagine that. Quote, Beijing can snap its fingers and put up untold cellular towers overnight. But in the long run, I have more faith in the U.S. system, says FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. There you go. In June, the Chinese government granted 5G licenses to wireless carriers months earlier than anticipated. By the end of the year, this is a quote, by the end of the year, it's clear that China will have more 5G than any other place on the planet. And by the end of 2020, they will have 100 million 5G users, said Chris Lane, a Bernstein analyst. That's far more than any other country. The article goes on. If you're a scientist, where do you want to do it? Said retired General Robert Spalding, who was essentially forced out of the White House's National Security Council. You want to do it where they're doing the research and have the money. And another lovely highlight from the article. Just so much gold in this, right? They should call this article Socialism Works. That's what they should call the article. Instead, they call it China winning the race for 5G because, why? Well, this is a classic. This is classic. A typical steel cellular tower costs $80,000 in the U.S. because China's telecom regulator mandates that its 3 carriers share the same tower. It's common to see 3 sets of antennas stacked on top of each other. They also cut equipment and energy costs by sharing power converters, the fiber optic cables that provide connectivity, and other equipment on or around the tower. Yes, in capitalism, you have a bunch of different corporations competing with each other. They all have different cell towers. They all use different resources to build those cell towers. Even when they do share cell towers, which apparently they occasionally do, they're using different power generators, power converters. But socialism, the government, simply steps in and forces 3 state-controlled corporations that operate according to what the party says, tells them what to do. And it's because of socialism and central planning that China is speeding ahead when it comes to 5G Wi-Fi. 5th-generation wireless, not Wi-Fi. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, I'm reading to you from the Wall Street Journal that with socialist central planning, China is making itself a 5G, leader. It's going to be the top 5G because of socialism. You read the article, they're practically begging the U.S. government to get more involved in the 5G efforts, which I'm sure that all of the Wi-Fi or wireless carriers in the U.S. would love to have more government involvement. But China's speeding ahead because state central planning is enabling them to effectively expand their 5G network. There you go. Just like China makes the majority of the world's steel, just like China at this point has the fastest trains in the world, just like China is doing great things when it comes to issues like what do you call it? Issues like artificial intelligence, made in China 2025, facial recognition software. China is having all these breakthroughs. 800 million people lifted out of poverty because they don't deal with the irrationality of capitalism. And thank you for that super chat, Sharon Pitts. So there you go. I just couldn't resist reading you that article. A couple other things that came to mind as I was reading the Wall Street Journal. This article, China has a soft power problem. Now, of course, this article is anti-China, trying to say that China is not as good at making movies and promoting its own culture, but that it has an important point to make for those of us who are critical of Western capitalism, right? It can't seem to compete with the West in crucial mainstream genres such as movies, popular music, fashion, novels, and the like. I say crucial because without universalizing its culture at a popular level, China cannot ultimately sell a lifestyle for the world to emulate, a set of aspirations that people elsewhere might embrace, nor can it make its engagement with other cultures more palatable and less like an intrusion to outsiders. Quote, the West was able to eclipse its darker history abroad with its popular culture, a process that Chinese leaders studied very deliberately in recent years. Folks, this article is confirming what I have said many times, which is Hollywood is deeply political. Hollywood is a vehicle through which Western capitalism spreads its ideology and viewpoint around the world. All right? I'll read you that one sentence I read you, which is a quote. The West was able to eclipse its darker history abroad. That darker history being slavery, that darker history being the slaughter of the native people, that darker history being the Vietnam War that killed millions of Vietnamese people, civilians, bombed dikes, that darker history being the Korean War that bombed and destroyed every building above 1 story tall on the Korean Peninsula, the northern part. The West was able to eclipse its darker history abroad with its popular culture, a process that Chinese leaders studied very deliberately in recent years. Yes, the reason that when I go to Iran and when I go to Venezuela and when I go to Russia, I meet young people who think the United States is a Disneyland playground, that think that all Americans live their life the way the Real Housewives of New Jersey do. The reason for that is because of a huge effort by Hollywood. The entertainment industry is one of the most effective weapons in spreading the mythology of Western capitalism. Western capitalism needs Hollywood. And, it's funny, the right wing doesn't like Hollywood. And I did a story about this. They don't much care for Trump and Hollywood. Hollywood don't much care for Trump. Trump don't much care for Hollywood. But to call Hollywood socialist is completely ridiculous. To call Hollywood anti-capitalist is ridiculous. Hollywood is like the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, Hollywood is socially liberal, right? Hollywood has always been pushing back decency, more pornography, more violence in films, more drug use, things that socially conservatives object to. Hollywood wants to sell tickets, so it's been rolling that back. So Hollywood's not conservative, but when it comes to economics, Hollywood is all about wealth and money and rich movie stars and people driving fancy cars and people not being loyal to each other but being ruthlessly career-oriented. And it is the worst of both worlds. It is liberalism incarnated, the Western ideology that puts individualism above all else. That's Hollywood. That is Hollywood to a T. It is liberalism. It is pushing radical individualism and selfishness and lack of concern and lack of community like crazy. That's Hollywood. And the West realizes this. The Pentagon realizes this. Wall Street realizes this. The big oil conglomerates realize this. Hollywood is an ideological vehicle through which the thinking of the Western world, Western capitalist thinking, Western capitalist ideology can be promoted. And it always has been. What was the first full-length movie ever made? It was called The Birth of a Nation, and it was a racist propaganda film that President Woodrow Wilson was very closely involved with. What was the first full-length movie in color? It was The Grapes of... Or no, it wasn't. It was Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind. Another racist propaganda film. What was the first movie to have sound? The first full-length movie to have sound. It was The Jazz Singer. Also quite a racist movie. It's kind of interesting to think about, but racism and Hollywood have historically kind of walked hand in hand. What was the first cartoon? Steamboat Willie. A lot of people see Steamboat Willie as kind of a racist cartoon also. If you look over the history of film, racism is a big part of it. Racism is very, very big. Very, very big part of it. Liberal Hollywood is a thing we start to see in the 30s, right? But Hollywood seems to like Franklin Roosevelt. It seems to not like the Ku Klux Klan. It seems to not like, there's a movie that Humphrey Bogart made called The Black Legion, which shows a group kind of like the Klan that wear black hoods called the Black Legion. It shows them as a ugly, rotten, racist, fascist group and a ripoff. You got The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. Great movie. It's a physical comedy, kind of a comedy making fun of fascism. But at the end, Charlie Chaplin, who was very close to the Communist Party at the time, gives a beautiful, beautiful speech criticizing capitalism and calling for a democratic upsurge of popular power. Just beautiful stuff. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Liberal, what you can call liberal or left-wing Hollywood, is very much a development of Roosevelt and his Bonapartism. And it's rolled back. McCarthyism, Hollywood is socially very liberal because that sells tickets. But Hollywood loves free markets and capitalism, and it loves profits, and it loves individualism, and it loves deconstruction, and it loves the Western ideology. Hollywood is Hollywood. It is an institution, and the West realizes this. And there's a great fear of some kind of alternative to Hollywood arising from the anti-imperialist bloc, right? When the Oriental film metropolis that was built by one of the richest men in China, right? If that could really get going, if China could effectively buy one of the big Hollywood studios, which a Chinese billionaire tried to do, and then they blocked him from doing that, yeah. Hollywood is an effective vehicle in spreading Western capitalism. I'd say it's more effective than bombs. It's more effective than tanks. It's more effective than drones. When people are being attacked, they tend to cling to their community. They tend to, bond with each other and come together to try and resist that attack. But Hollywood movies promote the selfishness, the greed, the disillusionment, the individualism that tears people apart and makes them so much more easy to conquer. When people have lost their community, when people have lost the ties that bind them to each other, when people are just drowning in selfishness and greed and narcissism and cynicism, when that happens, people are much easier to control and subjugate and conquer. When people don't have class consciousness, when people don't have national pride, when people don't consider themselves to be part of a community or part of a family, when people are ripped apart and isolated to atomized individuals, they're far easier to conquer and destroy and crush. And Hollywood knows that, and Hollywood is more effective in doing that, far more effective in doing that than any military. And yes, that must be said. But what else is on people's minds tonight? What else is on people's minds tonight? One more item from the Wall Street Journal I wanted to talk about. The secret of charter schools. The secret of charter schools' success, parents. There you go, folks. Charter schools are not better than public schools in the United States, except And that's the point. Charter schools are not better than public schools, except, right? And this is why the debate around public schools and the debate around quote unquote school choice and privatization, that's why it's so tainted. Is that, yes, there are charter schools that only take high performing students and only take students with deeply involved parents. And is it a surprise that those schools do better than the public schools? Of course not, because the public schools take everybody. But if you have a special charter school, it's very selective in who it takes. And very, very selective in having high-performing students. High-performing students with parents that are involved. Of course it's going to do better. And let me add, there are certain charter schools that don't do so well. I had friends when I lived in Cleveland who had not been doing well in school, and as a result, they were sent to a charter school for underperforming students. And I talked to these students, and they told me what should be illegal. What is a crime? This certain charter school that they attended did not have teachers teaching. It had students sitting in front of computer screens, clicking next, 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 and then answering multiple choice questions about what they had just read. They described to me a gymnasium full of quote-unquote underperforming or problematic students, sitting there with headphones on, clicking next, 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 previous, next, and filling out multiple choice questions. And a teacher that is non-union standing in the back of the room of hundreds of students, making sure no one talked to anyone else and that they were silent as they hit next, next, next. The fact that any child would go to such a school, especially when they're guaranteed the right to an education in many state constitutions of the United States. The fact that any child would go to such a school in the United States is a crime. It is absolutely a crime. The American educational system is a big, huge mess. But the notion that schools for profit is the answer is absolutely not the case, is absolutely wrong. And the notion that schools for profit just naturally do better, no. Certain schools for profit that only admit high-performing students, that only admit students that have heavy parental involvement, yes, they do better. And is the current situation with American education, good? Are public schools good? Public schools in the U.S. are pretty awful. Let's be real. They are pretty awful. The teachers' unions, in theory, I agree with teachers' unions and I support them, but let's be real. There's a lot of incompetent teachers. There's a lot of teachers that are not doing their jobs very well, that get a level of protection and mistreat students, and there are things that teachers' unions do that aren't so good. In overall, teachers' unions are good, but I have some criticism. Anyone who's been through U.S. public schools does. But this notion that charter schools and the privatization of education is the answer, that Miss Betsy DeVos, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not for it. Not for it. And it's a disaster. So I want to talk about the couple things people asked me about. First of all, I guess I'll talk about the first one, which is Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe is an African leader, and he was involved in the Rhodesian Bush War. Right? People don't seem to realize that prior to what is now Zimbabwe, there existed a white settler colonialist state called Rhodesia. Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Scholarship Program is also named after Cecil Rhodes. And Rhodesia was an apartheid state. And it was horrendous. And the land was owned by white settlers. People were exploited. They talk about, sundown towns where they brought in the African people to labor and work, but if they were there after dark, they could be killed. Horrendous stuff. It was apartheid in South Africa, but it was Rhodesia. There was this thing called the Rhodesian Bush War, in which the African people, with the aid of the Soviet Union and China, they formed ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, and ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union. One was the Maoists and one was the pro-Soviet group, and they fought against the British and against the Rhodesian settler regime. And the war went on, and finally the war ended. And it ended with the Lancaster Agreement, the Lancaster House Agreement, a peace treaty that was signed. And the peace treaty, you read the terms of the peace treaty. So, Rhodesia was toppled. They created Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe, the new government, was required to start paying the retirement pensions of all the people who worked for the old government. Ian Smith, who had been the leader and basically the dictator of the apartheid Rhodesian government, Ian Smith, despite the fact that he killed whole villages and exterminated people, had committed a huge amount of war crimes, was never arrested. He even was allowed to have a seat in the government, never faced any penalty for his activities. And there was an agreement that no property would be seized for 10 years following the peace treaty. So Rhodesia, the white settler colonial state, was wiped off the map. Right? They say that wipe off the map means kill everybody. No. Rhodesia, the white settler colonial state, was wiped off the map, just like the Dutch East Indies was wiped off the map. A colonial settler state got wiped off the map, and there was not a genocide. There wasn't killing of white people in mass, right? Most of the white people kept their land at first. Ian Smith, the leader of the former apartheid colonial regime, got to keep his big mansion and have a role in the government even though he had committed mass murder and war crimes and genocide, no penalty. And Robert Mugabe, the leader, was like the Ho Chi Minh or the Kim Il-sung or the Mao of Zimbabwe. He became the president, and he won the elections because he was popular. He was the face of the anti-colonial uprising, and he united the Maoists and the Soviets into one organization, ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, which is a Marxist-Leninist communist party. They took power, and they presided over a capitalist free market state. They followed to the letter the Lancaster House Agreement, and they didn't violate it. And then, starting in 1997, they began to nationalize some of the land and redistribute it to the African people. Land that had been seized by colonialism, by white settlers with machine guns who had gunned down whole villages and seized land. They redistributed it with compensation in many cases. They began redistributing land. And all of a sudden, the media that had praised Mugabe, right? Because when the struggle against apartheid in South Africa was going on, Mugabe was held up as a good example. Nelson Mandela was described as a dangerous radical, but Mugabe, look, he didn't touch any of their property. Mugabe was actually, being treated, by the Western media as if he was a good example. But then finally, when the time came, Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF government began redistributing land. And all of a sudden, I'll tell you, Mugabe's name had never been on TV. Nobody knew who he was except for people that really closely followed. But all of a sudden, U.S. media went into overdrive about Robert Mugabe's a dictator. Robert Mugabe is an evil dictator. He's taking land. Oh, he's racist against white people. Oh, my God. I had never seen it before. It was unbelievable. And all of a sudden, all these people who'd never heard of Mugabe before, never protested, against the government of Saudi Arabia that cuts gay people's heads off. All of a sudden, they were morally outraged about Mugabe being homophobic, which he was. And it was so contrived. So contrived. Immediately, all the big Western corporations that were seeing their property being seized, it was unbelievable. And as China began to invest in Zimbabwe, which they did, right? One of the biggest waterfall in the world, the Victoria Falls. Who do you think that's named after, mind you? The Victoria Falls, right? Victoria Falls, named after Queen Victoria. right? No, colonialism, right? China worked with Zimbabwe to build a road getting to Victoria Falls so tourists could come see it. To build a hotel near the Victoria Falls. So, just basic, taking a really poor African country and trying to have some level of economic development. And the response is, this is a brutal regime that must be overthrown. This is a brutal communist dictator. Oh my God. And the foundation money for gay rights activists, they were out there. He's a homophobe. And we were told he's a ruthless. And then, so we put sanctions, the United States put sanctions on Zimbabwe, right? I believe there was even a national emergency declared so we could punish Zimbabwe some more. And then, of course, they're having economic problems. So then, of course, see, socialism is starving people. Oh, the communist regime is starving. It's the same old story we've always seen. The exact same story. When I was in Russia for the World Festival of Youth and Students, I had the honor of meeting with young people from the Zimbabwe African National Union. Young people who love their country and are trying their hardest to get their people out of poverty. And, is that to say there's not a huge amount of corruption in Zimbabwe like there is in every developing country? No, there's a huge amount of corruption in Zimbabwe. But the notion that the government of Zimbabwe has no right to redistribute the farms, wrong. The notion that the government of Zimbabwe has no right to nationalize the diamond mines, and so the people of Zimbabwe make wealth from one of their greatest exports, diamonds. They're 13% of the world's diamond exports, I believe. Robert Mugabe is a communist, was a communist, and he led the people of one of the poorest countries on earth in overthrowing a white settler colonialist regime, redistributing the land, and trying to get the people out of poverty. And there were some successes. They've wiped out illiteracy in Zimbabwe. One of the highest literacy, I shouldn't say they wiped it out, but it's one of the highest rates of literacy on the African continent in Zimbabwe. That's an achievement. Redistributing land, that was a good move. They've enabled people that were without property, people in the military who fought for the revolution, to have a little piece of land and have their own farm. Good for them, right? They've nationalized the diamond mines so that when diamonds are pulled out of the earth in Zimbabwe, the profits don't go to some big international corporation like De Beers. Instead, they go into the hands of the state treasury of Zimbabwe, and they can maybe build some more healthcare clinics and all of that. They're doing the best they can. But you have to remember, this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And, you have a communist revolution in one of the poorest countries in the world, and then what? Right? And I'm not saying everything he ever did was right. Some of the anti-gay statements he made were atrocious. I don't defend that. Corruption, big problem with corruption. And I know in the final years, he wanted his wife to be the successor in the party. And that was not what the people of the Zimbabwe African National Union wanted. And there was a big internal fight, and he was kind of pushed out of politics by his own party, by the Communist Party, the ZANU-PF party. They pushed him out of politics because he was wanting his wife to be his successor as the president, and the people of Zimbabwe and the ruling Communist Party, ZANU-PF, they didn't want it. And so there you go. So it's complicated. But Mugabe, overall, his legacy is getting rid of Rhodesia. His legacy is redistributing land. His legacy is fighting against illiteracy in that country. His legacy is nationalizing the diamond mines. And so his legacy overall, I think achievements were made, and I think good things were done. Does that mean that there weren't serious violations of human rights? Does that mean that there weren't issues with corruption? I'm not denying the bad things that happened. He certainly had no love for gay people. I was at the UN. I remember when I was at the UN and he said, "We are not gay." That was interesting. But hey, he's an anti-colonial fighter, fought for his people, and raised people, tried to take measures to get his country out of poverty. I think that the demonization of Robert Mugabe as a dictator, as just, this evil, rotten dictator, horrible man, that's a lie. Robert Mugabe represented the anti-colonial struggle of the people of Zimbabwe. There would be no Zimbabwe if it weren't for Mugabe. And there would be no tourism, really. I mean, the tourism in Zimbabwe, his work with China, I think the man is being subject to a post-mortem smear campaign, and that's not right. It's not right the way they're dancing on his grave right now. I think the average people of Zimbabwe, the working people of Zimbabwe, saw him as their champion and really benefited as a result of his leadership. And as hard as it was, and as poor as Zimbabwe is and still is, he was somebody who stood up for his people. And I don't I don't appreciate the way the media is dancing on his grave. I think that he did some very, very good things for the country in terms of redistributing the land, in terms of fighting against illiteracy, in terms of, getting rid of the colonial apartheid regime. So there you go. I said that. I'm sure I'll get flack for it, and there you go. But yeah, I don't appreciate the way he's being talked about, and so there you go. I hope that answers the question that Owen and others had about Mugabe. When it comes to, and wow, it's funny, we're going from Mugabe to Sam Marcy because someone asked about Sam Marcy, and this is interesting because I never knew Sam Marcy, and that was always like, well, I don't want to get into too much, and I'm not going to talk too much. You're asking about Sam Marcy. I'll tell you who Sam Marcy was. So Sam Marcy was really named Sam Balan or Balin. He was born in Ukraine, and he was an immigrant to the United States. The area that he lived in had been under the control of the Red Army. Then it was under the control of the White Army, so his family fled. They came to the United States to get away from the White Army. He was a Jewish person, so the White Army was very anti-Semitic. So, when the Red Army was driven out of the area his family lived in, and the White Army came in there, they fled to the United States. He lived in Brooklyn. And in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, as a young man in his 20s, I believe, early 20s, he was a leader of the Communist Party USA in Brooklyn. I believe he was the head of the Young Communist League of Brooklyn in the 1930s, which back then, when the Young Communist League was tens of thousands of people in Brooklyn, that was a very important rank to have. Like, he was a high-up member of the Communist Party. He ended up, and there's disagreements. He had disagreements with the Communist Party. And there's no question that he was discriminated against in the Communist Party, because the Communist Party at that point in the 1930s was always accused of being foreign agents, right? He was Russian-born. He had a Russian accent his whole life. He had kind of a thick Brooklyn Russian accent. He was not U.S.-born. He was Jewish. And that the Communist Party USA was trying its hardest to make clear that they were not foreign agents, that they were not agents of the USSR. They were an American party. Their leaders during the 1930s were William Z. Foster, who was an Irish American born in Philadelphia, Catholic family background, but atheist, communist, and Earl Browder, the man from Kansas with an English ethnic background and from a farming state. And the Communist Party USA was really playing up that they were American, right? They were not foreign agents. And Sam Marcy, like most of the Communist Party's membership, was an immigrant. He was Jewish, had a thick foreign accent. And even though he was closer, at that point, the Communist Party USA's membership was mainly immigrants, people from Eastern Europe, people from Ireland, a lot of African-American folks who weren't immigrants, but, were African-American, were marginalized. The Communist Party USA was a party very much of marginalized communities in the United States. And that divide, like when they were formed, the Socialist Party had been the party of, Kansas socialists and social democrats and wealthy reformers, and the Communist Party became the party of immigrants and the party of African Americans. But regardless, they were constantly being accused of being foreign subversives, Bolshevik foreign agents, and all that. So there's no question that Sam Marcy, this young man from Brooklyn, that despite the fact that that he was probably closer to what the average member of the Communist Party was like, foreign-born, spoke multiple languages, he was discriminated against because the Communist Party was really trying to protect itself from the label of foreign agents and traitors. And I think that bothered Sam Marcy, right? And he talked about it. From what I understand, later in his life, he talked about how much that effort to be American on the part of the Communist Party was not good. It was tailing reaction. At one point, the Communist Party USA in the 30s moved its headquarters to Chicago because Chicago was the center of the country and it was a more industrial city. I think that was the right move. I think it was correct to have the Communist Party USA's headquarters in Chicago, but Sam Marcy didn't think that, right? Sam Marcy felt like New York City was more international, like New York City had more immigrant communities and all of that. He thought that the Communist Party moving its headquarters to Chicago when he was in it was an awful decision. It was tailing reaction. Regardless, Sam Marcy ended up joining the Trotskyite organization, the Socialist Workers' Party, but he never really fit in the Socialist Workers' Party because he was too pro-Soviet, and he liked the Soviet Union. He admired the Soviet Union. Sam Marcy, was in the Trotskyist group, and he and a group of dissident Trotskyists, I guess you'd call them, people that were Trotskyists, they were they were very much more pro-Soviet than your average Trotskyist in New York City. They moved to Buffalo, New York, where there was no Trotskyite organization, and they formed their own wing of the Socialist Workers' Party. And then, in 1959, their wing of the Socialist Workers' Party that was known as the Global Class War Tendency, they had opposed the Hungarian revolt of 1956, and they'd supported the Soviet Union in putting that revolt down. They blamed the Soviet Union for the revolt, but they still felt like the revolt itself was a reactionary revolt. It was led by this fascist priest, Cardinal Vinsanti, and so Sam Marcy is always considered to be more pro-Soviet than the rest of the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Trotskyists ended up forming the Workers' World Party, which I was part of for many years. I'm no longer affiliated with them, and I disagree with them on many points. That's Sam Marcy. Very charismatic guy. Very short. A short fellow, long bony fingers, and a genius from what I understand. He understood economics. He had really deep understanding of economics. He really understood politics. Fidel Castro made a point of meeting with him on numerous occasions. Kim Il-sung met with him on numerous occasions. Really cutting edge, and kind of a mentor to young people. The Workers' World Party, from what I understand, was very small. For its first 10 years of existence, it was like less than 30 people. But when the 1960s political upsurge happened, and there was all these young people out protesting, Sam Marcy figured out how to recruit them. And he was such a good mentor. He listened to the young people. He found out what their skills were. He unleashed them to go out and put those skills into practice, and he built a group that by the 70s was probably well over 1,000 people from his little group of 30. When the Maoist movement kind of collapsed, as I've talked about on other lives, the Workers' World Party that he was the leader of kept going. They became the movement party in the 80s, by the 80s and up into the 90s, even as the Soviet Union's falling. They were the ones that organized big anti-war rallies in Washington, D.C., and that was Sam Marcy. And, he was, in terms of U.S. American communists, he's one of the most effective, And I would encourage people to check out his writings. I don't agree with him on a couple pretty key points. He liked Leon Trotsky, but he was also critical of Trotsky. And his views on Stalin versus Trotsky they're not clear. Some days you read him, sometimes he sounds like a total Trotskyist, other times he sounds like a total Stalinist. His views on a lot of issues aren't exactly clear. But someone called the Deaf Mute is asking me to describe China's version of socialism. Okay, so I'm going to come at that question a couple different ways. First of all, right, so socialism is a tool. Socialism is a tool. It is not a goal. That's a problem that a lot of people have. And that's you watch my debate with that game streamer fellow. People expect that socialism is like the ideal paradise society. It's not. It's not. Socialism is the goal. Socialism is not the goal. Socialism is the tool. Socialism is when society comes together and controls the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power and forces them to operate in the interest of society. And socialism, a society where the means of production, the centers of economic power, operate according to a predetermined plan, as Frederick Engels put it, not according to what is just profitable for individual capitalists. There have been many different incarnations of socialism. The Soviet Union was the first society that really had socialism. The Paris Commune was only around for a couple weeks, but they were eventually going to be socialist, but then they were toppled after a couple weeks. But the Soviet Union was the first socialist society. They didn't really become a socialist society until 1928. 1928, they launched the 5-year plans. They built up a whole bunch of industries that were controlled by the state, and they developed a political model that you could call really existing socialism or real socialism. Some people call it Stalinism, but it's, that was one model of socialism. China had its own, tried to have that model for a while, and they adjusted it in the 1980s. And their model that they've developed is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that involves free market zones where foreign capitalists can invest. That involves all kinds of stuff. It involves big state-run industries and state-controlled banking. It involves an elite stock market that most of the population isn't connected to. Very little, like it's a very small percentage of the Chinese population that's in any way tied into the stock market. It involves 5-year economic plans. It involves building up, kind of state-controlled mega corporations that have foreign investment but are ultimately controlled by the state. It's similar to the national champions that exist in Russia, like Gazprom and Rosneft. In China, they have Huawei Technologies. They've got Dalian Wanda, the real estate corporation. They've got Alibaba, the online supplier company. It's building these kind of national champion corporations that are controlled by the state but have a lot of foreign investors. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is a system, but it's in flux, and it's always changing. The way it was in the 1990s is very different than the way it is today. The way it was in the 80s is very different than the 90s. The way it was during the Mao era is very different than how it is now. I mean, the early Mao era of the 50s, China, didn't have, it had some state-run industries, but mostly a market economy. In the 60s, it moved toward almost, like a Soviet-style economy. And in the 70s, in the 80s, socialism is not the same everywhere. And that's why asking me what I think personally should be nationalized, what should not be nationalized, isn't a way to answer the question of is socialism better than capitalism? Because socialism looks different. Ba'athist Arab socialism looks different than Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela. Bolivarian socialism looks different than socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? Juche socialism in Korea looks very different than Bolivarianism in Venezuela. Like, every country has its own road to socialism, and those roads to socialism are always adapting and changing. There's no Chinese model. There's no American model. There are going to be different evolutions and leaps. What makes it socialism is that profits are not in command. When profits are not in command, right? When the economy functions according to what is good for society, not according to profits, that's socialism. And when profits are in command, that's capitalism. And state capitalism, I saw somebody mention state capitalism. State capitalism is a real phenomenon, but it's capitalism. State capitalism is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, huge amount of state involvement, but all the state does is make sure that the royal family can make profits. Singapore, another example of state capitalism. Heavy state involvement, right? The government's all over regulating industry, all kinds, but doing it in order to make sure that the 5 kind of ruling families continue to make profits, right? After the Second World War, Britain was state capitalist, right? I mean, they nationalized everything because it had all been blown up, and they rebuilt it, and they facilitated capitalist profits, and then they privatized it in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher, right? The difference between capitalism and socialism is production being carried out for profit, or is production being forced to be done in the interest of society? And in a socialist society, the difference between private and public doesn't exactly make sense. It's not that simple. Private companies in China must do what the Communist Party says. At any point, the Communist Party can show up and say, you will do this, and they have to do it. So even private companies can't really carry out production according to what is in the interest of themselves, right? At any point, they can be interrupted. They're functioning according to their profits, but there's an understanding they have no property rights, that the state and their right to control production, to be in the interest of all of society trumps the right of private companies to make profits. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism, and it needs to be made abundantly clear. So that is me describing the Chinese model. I hope that that answers your question. What else is on people's minds? What else is on people's minds today? I'm talking about whatever people want to talk about. I'm having a great time here. I hope you are as well. Right. I like aspects of Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's a good guy. Better than so much of what's being offered here. Argentina, right? I see Kevin asking me about Argentina. Well, Argentina has had the Macri government for the past few years, and it's wrecked their economy. It's been a disaster, neoliberalism. So now Cristina Kirchner and Fernandez Fernandez and Kirchner are running and probably going to win the upcoming election, and they're gonna dump neoliberalism, and good for them. I think that's great. They're left Peronists, right? They follow Juan Perón, the kind of nationalistic figure who was also kind of anti-capitalist, admirer of Che Guevara, but a complicated figure in Argentina's history, Juan Perón. I remember when I was in Ecuador in 2013, the young Peronists were there, and I remember seeing this like literature table where they had a mural of Hugo Chavez and Juan Perón holding hands. And at the time, I'd been listening to a lot of the very confused American left, and I asked them, I said, "Isn't Juan Perón a fascist?" And the people behind the table, the young Argentines, said, "No, Juan Perón was the most true communist socialist that ever lived. Oh, Juan Perón," and that I was confused by that, but that shows why the American left is out to lunch, right? At this festival of world communists, right? The Communist Party of Argentina, all of them love Juan Perón. Well, that's because the way people in the West understand socialism and the way socialism develops around the world are not the same. And that was a lesson for me, and that forced me to look into studying Juan Perón. And Juan Perón was more pro-Che Guevara than the Communist Party of Argentina was. When Che Guevara died, the Communist Party of Argentina accused him of being a left adventurer and an extremist. And Juan Perón said that one of the greatest Peronists in history was our great Che Guevara. So it's not so simple. Juan Perón also said that Fidel Castro was one of the greatest Peronists ever, and he spent a lot of time in Cuba. It's not as simple as that, right? Was Juan Perón a Marxist? No, he wasn't, right? He believed in his own ideas, right? He said the problem wasn't capitalism, it was the international syndicarchy or something. He was ideologically not a Marxist, but he was anti-capitalist, he was anti-imperialist, he was confused, he had some admiration for fascism in Europe, but people in Argentina who call themselves Peronists, especially left Peronists, really admire him. And it's complicated. Things are more complicated. People who want to just pin labels on people don't get it. They just don't get it. Yeah. So, I hope that answers your question. And Cristina Kirchner, who is a left Peronist, is great. I think she's great. She's done great things for the country. I hope she's back in office. They've tried to get her for corruption, but populism. Populism shouldn't be a dirty word in left-wing circles. It shouldn't be about leftism. Shouldn't be about appealing to what is popular among the alienated fringe. It should be about trying to build a mass movement to build a better life for the people, stand up for the rights of the people on behalf of the elite. Populism is not a bad word. I don't think populism is a bad word. That must be said. What else is on people's minds? People are asking me all kinds of stuff today. I'm having a good time here. We're doing great. We're having a good evening. Oh, someone's asking me about accelerationism. Well, let's talk about accelerationism, right? Because that's a common thought. That's a common thought, right? When someone's new to socialism, they say, well, you know what? I want the economy to crash. I want everyone to lose their jobs. Why? Why do I want everyone to lose their jobs? Well, I want everyone to lose their jobs so we have a revolution. That's what I want. No, you don't. 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 Get worse so that we have a revolution is wrong, because revolutions don't happen because life gets worse. That's part of it. But revolutions happen. Revolutions happen because the people are in motion. And if things get worse, and there is no resistance on the part of the people, and there's no movement against it, if things just get worse, that actually makes things worse. That actually makes things worse because then people are demoralized, right? That mass movements against injustice have the ability to turn bad things into an upsurge of political resistance. But in the absence of a mass movement, making things worse generally leads to people being even more demoralized. So, that's an illusion. I remember when I was part of Occupy Wall Street, there was a group of like kind of anarchist and activist young people that I was around, and I was, protesting for jobs. And they were saying, we want people to be unemployed because then we'll have a revolution. And I was saying, no, you don't want people to be unemployed. You want to have a movement that's so powerful it forces the government to start giving people jobs, and then people will see how powerful the movement is. There you go. Now, someone's telling me they don't agree with my definition here, and I'll be curious to hear what their definition is. That's how I've always understood the concept of accelerationism. But there you go. What else is new, folks? What else is on your mind? Now, someone's asking me about the Tankie narrative. Hey, one of my most popular videos I made is called Why Be a Tankie? And I talk about why I'm basically a Tankie, why I'm in a Tankie category. And so I think the term Tankie is a derogatory term. It started out in the British Communist Party. When the British Communist Party was divided between Euro-communists who were turning against the Soviet Union and pro-Soviet forces, the derogatory term they gave to pro-Soviet forces was tankies. And it referred to the fact that whenever there's a Soviet military intervention, it's portrayed as big, huge tanks rolling in. Now, why is it portrayed that way? Because that way it fits into this liberal narrative, right? That the state is this ruthless, heartless machine crushing the rights of the individual. The tank was like a fixed Afghanistan. And it talks about when the Soviet Union sent its forces to Afghanistan and how, this one reporter, Philip Benoski, was in Afghanistan at that time. And in his book, he describes how he was in Afghanistan, in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union sent its forces to the country, and how there was one tank in the whole city. One single tank. And that was where all the Western media cameras surrounded. All the TV networks from NBC and BBC and ABC, they all in a park, a Soviet tank. And all the Western media huddled around this tank because that's what the narrative was. It wasn't that the Soviet Union was coming to help the people of Afghanistan defeat Al-Qaeda, to help the literacy brigades continue teaching people to read, to help the Young Democrats League rebuild the country. Oh, no. There was one tank. And all, according to Philip Benoski and his overview of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, he was there, and all the media surrounded one single tank because that's what their narrative was about. It was about one tank, and that is propaganda. Right? And the tank, the Soviet tank with its red Soviet star, and that's a big fixture of imperialist propaganda. And with Tiananmen and all of that, where you got the one individual waving his flag in front of the tank, the ruthless, heartless state, is crushing the great individual. It's pushing this ideology. I was talking about Hollywood before. It's pushing this ideology. It's you against the world. The masses of people and their millions, the nations, the countries, the classes, they're all the mob, right? As Ayn Rand puts it in The Fountainhead. They're the mob. They're the mob coming to take away your individuality. Your individualism, your Facebook, your Twitter is the most important thing, and no one else matters. No one else matters. It's you against the mob. You against the mob. That is the ideology pushed by Western media. So that that Tiananmen, that one guy standing in front of the ruthless, heartless tank, that is Western capitalist ideology. So that needs to be said. So the tanky narrative that you can be a leftist, sure. You can be critical of capitalism. You can write a manifesto about how in your ideal society everyone would get a free pizza on Saturday and the factories will be painted green because green is the ideal color, and destiny can rip apart your perfect specific narrative. But if you defend those ruthless societies where the mob runs things, they have tanks, and you're a tankie. If you dare defend societies that have broken out of Western capitalism, you're a tankie, because everyone knows that all those societies are is ruthless, rotten machines that crush great individuals, right? That's the narrative. It is Western liberalism's narrative, and the tank is an essential part of it. That must be said. We're doing great, folks. It's interesting. Now, earlier on this live, I was talking about classical music, and it's interesting, and that gets me to something that I wanted to just touch on. Okay, so I've told you all that, and it's interesting. I've told you all that in some ways I feel like even though my views are very far left, my mind kind of works like a conservative. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, and when I was fourth, fifth grade, I had a clock radio in my room, and it was my alarm clock, and that was my radio to listen to. And my parents were very, very strict, and they forbid me. They said, you must listen to only the public radio station. So I was only allowed to listen to WKSU, which was the Kent State University public radio station that played NPR. But during the evenings, when I was falling asleep, they only had two programs. On weeknights, they had classical music, which I didn't really listen to. I just kind of fell asleep. On the weekends, they had folk music, American folk music, which I tended to listen to more because it was the weekends. I was staying up, and folk music caught my attention more at that age. So every night from about fifth grade up until maybe high school, every night I was listening to classical music or American folk music because my parents were very restrictive and authoritarian, and I think at one point I remember I changed it to a rap station. And that was like a fight that went on in my house for like 5 days. And my parents would come to the door and hear me listening to that rap, and they didn't approve of that. They'll turn that off. That's not okay. I was rebelling. I was listening to the rap, and they'd open the door. We told you not to listen to that rap music. But regardless, I was listening to classical music. I was listening to folk music. And regardless, I was doing that every night. I was never really tuned into the mainstream music. It was almost like frowned on, right? That if I knew popular mainstream music, I guess when I was like, I think Britney Spears and NSYNC and the Backstreet, it was almost considered that being interested in that was like that was wrong, right? That kind of showed you were being irresponsible. It was weird the way I was brought up. But I grew up in a very, very small town. In fact, a lot of the people in my town were Mennonites, which is a pretty archaic religion. A lot of others were just mainstream evangelical Christians, but there were even some Mennonites in my town. And I guess even though I have far left views and I read Marx and all that, it's funny because in a way you can see a conservative side to me, right? And I've talked about this before. I have that go, go, go. Right? I want to get things done. I'm never satisfied. I want to keep trudging ahead, marching forward. I'm very go, go, go oriented. Right? So I think I talk about, perhaps there's some touch of that old America that's got a lot of problems with racism and all that. But there's a touch of that Tom Sawyer stuff in me, right? And that, that frontier mentality, that Norman Rockwell stuff in me. Perhaps that's the case. But regardless, can you all still see me? Can you all still see me? Am I still streaming? Am I here? Right? It seems like it said unable to reconnect, and then I pushed reconnect. Don't know what's going on. But hey, I'm here. right? And perhaps I argue things more like a conservative. Perhaps I see things more the way conservatives do. Even though my views are left wing, perhaps my mind works. I grew up around deeply conservative people, deeply, rural, religious folks. That's who I grew up around. So maybe, despite the fact that my political views are what they are, maybe I still see things in a conservative way. But it bothers me, and I've talked about this with Ramiro. We had a great conversation about it that you can watch on YouTube, about how it is a problem. It's a big problem that leftism is associated with sloppiness and irresponsibility. And you go to left wing meetings and people aren't dressed nice. I mean, I always try to wear a suit when I'm giving a talk or I'm at a left wing gathering, and that in a lot of ways being left wing is associated with being lazy, with not having yourself together, and not good. I think people, we need to associate left wing with responsibility, and really what we are doing as leftists is we're taking responsibility. We're saying, look, we live in this country. We live in this country, and this country is being destroyed by the greed of bankers and billionaires and corporations, and we have personal responsibility to fix it up. And no, we're not going to, be locked out of the political process. And no, we're not going to be mesmerized by social media. We'll use social media, sure, but we're not going to let it control us. We're not going to be brainwashed. We're not going to blow our minds with drugs. We are going to take responsibility for the future of our country. That should be the message of leftists. We will get involved in the political process. We are going to change things. We are going to stand strong, and we're going to try to fix the disaster unfolding in the United States of America. We're going to do it. We're going to be the adults here. We're not going to be kids chasing after profits, saying, screw everybody else, I just want to make money, man. We're not going to do that. We're going to stand strong. We're going to take personal responsibility. We are going to be the adults in the room and say there is a big problem in America. Our water is not being properly purified. Our roads are falling apart. We're going to be, dare I say, conservative. But conservatives, modern conservatives, don't do that. Modern conservatives say, hey, let the free market take care of itself, right? Privatize everything. Who cares? Screw you. It's not my problem. If someone's poor, they probably deserve it, right? Being a conservative is tied up with worship of capitalism. And sure, it's tied up with homophobia and transphobia and whatever, but, and religion. But it's ultimately tied in with worship of capitalism, profits, greed, selfishness, and individualism. So those of us who believe in socialism, though we may be not socially conservative, some of us are, there are some, we're not going to let the country fall to shreds. It's time we had a government that was not in dereliction of duty, that was responsible, that got things done. Obligation to their child. And I've got to tell you that at this very moment, the government of the United States is guilty of neglect. It is letting the country crumble while making sure that the banks, factories, and industries continue to function and make profits for a billionaire group. And I would say the government of the United States is in complete dereliction of duty. It is. I'll conclude today's live. I'll recite what I've recited before. The last proclamation of Mao. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people and while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. I'll do the whole thing again because I know I'm buffering. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, folks, have a good week. I'm out.